Welcome to the Tales of a Red Clay Rambler podcast, featuring interviews with culture makers from around the world. This is Ben Carter. I'm going to be your host. If you'd like more information on the show, please visit our website, talesofaredclayrambler.com. Welcome back to episode 357 of the podcast. Thank you guys for tuning in. Today on the show, I talk with Jason Sandy. He is a modern-day mudlark, which is a person that searches through the anaerobic mud that is along the foreshore of the Thames River in London. It's amazing to hear stories of the objects that he has pulled out of the mud, along with his other fellow mudlarks that are working today. The city of London goes back to the Celtic times, so they have found everything from offerings to Celtic river gods to Samian ware from the Roman era to German saltware. Jason has recently published a book along with Nick Stevens titled Thames Mudlarking, Searching for London's Lost Treasures. The book is out now in Europe, and it will be released soon in early April in the United States. If you'd like to find out more about Jason, you can follow him on Instagram under Jason Mudlark. Before we get to that interview, I wanted to do today's Amico Community Corkboard, which is in support of Pot LA. They have been affected by the pandemic and need your help to keep their doors open for the next 6 months. Pot LA is a full-service studio owned and operated by artists of color, with a mission to create a space that feels accessible and empowering to those that feel marginalized in other ceramic spaces. If you'd like to donate directly to them, you can go to gofundme.com/help-pot. I'd also like to thank some of the folks that have been donating to keep the show on the air. We are listener supported, so I'd like to thank Deb Beam, Britta Schroeder, and Jim Turnbull for their recent contributions. If you'd like to get involved yourself, I would certainly appreciate that. You can make a donation today at talesofaredclayrambler.com/donate. Without further ado, we'll get to the interview. So to start off, can you explain what mudlarking is?
So mudlarking originally came from the Victorian mudlark. So back in the 19th century, there were a lot of poor kids that lived along the River Thames. And what they would do is at low tide, they would go down onto the exposed riverbank. And just to explain, in London, we're very close to the North Sea, the English Channel. And so we're heavily affected by the tidal pull of the sea. So the river level goes up and down 7 meters twice a day. So yeah, in feet and inches, that's the height of a 2-story building. That's how much the level of the water drops twice a day. So these Victorian kids would go out on the exposed riverbed, and they were really looking for anything that they could immediately resell. Obviously, they were hungry, they were desperate, they were mudlarking to survive. So they were looking for very practical items like coal, which every family used to heat their homes or to cook with. They were looking for timber. They were looking for any tools that had been dropped in the river, rope, chains, anything that they could immediately resell. That's what they were looking for. And they would take that to local shops, and in exchange for a loaf of bread or a few pence, they would trade those things in to monetize those things immediately and survive and supply food for their families.
The Thames is really what has made London and all of its sort of iterations, because it's a city that's evolved through, many different cultures over thousands of years, but it's the river that really has been both transportation and I think I saw it referred to almost as like the heartbeat or the center.
Yeah.
When you think about a city that has grown up around a river like this, we think about transportation, as I mentioned, but it also really became a repository for trash. At times it became something that was almost seen as spiritual. Like the river has meant a lot of different things to a lot of different people over time. What was your first connection to the River Thames?
Yeah, that's an interesting question because I moved to London. Originally, I was born in the United States in North Carolina. I've been living now in London for 13 years, and I lived previously in in Berlin for about 7 years. So in total, I've been in Europe for about 20, 21 years now. And when I first moved to London, coincidentally, we moved very close to the River Thames. I have two small children, and when they were much younger, we used to go down to the Thames, and especially at low tide, just to kind of throw pebbles and rocks into the water. And also, there's a lot of crabs and little baby eels and other wildlife that really attracted my kids' attention. So I've always loved the water, and I grew up along a lake when I was much younger myself. So I've always been attracted to the water, and just naturally, because the river was close to our house, we used to go there quite often.
Can you talk about one of the early finds that you made along the riverside where you realized, like, wait, this is more than a river. This is an archaeological site?
So, as I said, I've been down there many times with my kids. I had no idea that anything old was kind of laying around there. We were literally just looking for wildlife and not looking for anything man-made. So I was watching a show on the National Geographic Channel, and they had, it was entitled Thames Treasure Hunters, and it was about mudlarks, modern mudlarks, going down and finding these historically significant artifacts down on the riverbed when it was exposed. And I was like, oh my goodness, I've been living along the river for 4 years, and I haven't even thought about looking for anything of historical value or anything that was older than maybe the 1950s. So I went back I went back the weekend after I saw the show, and I was actively looking for, the first thing you see is broken bits of pottery, clay pipes, and some of the clay pipes are almost 400 years old themselves, and they would have been filled with tobacco from North Carolina and from Virginia, from the United States. So I was like, oh my goodness, this is amazing, this little piece of history. And as you were saying earlier, London has been around for 2,000 years. It was first started by the Romans back in 43 AD, and then it's just kind of blossomed into a thriving metropolis over the past 2,000 years. So all of this history is just lying there waiting to be discovered, and each tide reveals something new and something exciting.
So as the city developed, like what we think of London now is massive compared to, what it was originally in the Roman era. And even in the Celtic era before that, there was some trading that was going up and down the river.
Yes, yeah. As you were saying, it was a beating artery, the heart of the communities that were based around the River Thames. And in Celtic times, there were many small tribes that lived along the river, but they didn't really coalesce into like a larger body or like a village or a city. It was only the Romans that started a trading post, which then grew into the actual city that we know today. But one interesting thing, they really did worship the river, and they had several river gods. And interestingly, they would make beautiful pieces of, sometimes it was flint, like stone, that would be carved into beautiful kind of axe heads and other implements. And they would deposit those in the river as kind of a devotional offering or a votive offering to the river gods. And some of the most amazing things that have ever been found in the Thames, we think were these votive offerings, like swords, beautiful shields, even a horned helmet, a Celtic horned helmet was found in the Thames. And all of those, they think they were not used for actually warfare because they were much too flimsy. Also, they were quite small and very decorative. We think those were actually purposely put into the Thames as a votive offering to the gods.
One of the things I love about your book is that you go through different eras and talk about some of the things that were found. But I wanted to talk generally about a broader topic first, which is when people find things in the Thames, are you just allowed to keep everything? Like, what is the relationship in terms of the English state and everything that is found in that river? Who owns all of that stuff?
So technically, the queen owns everything. So she is the crown estate, and the crown estate owns the coastline of England as well as the riverbed of the River Thames. So as it's exposed, there's other landowners, but the crown estate is the largest landowner of the River Thames and the riverbed. So they've employed the Port of London Authority that's based in London, and they actually monitor and manage the river on behalf of the Crown Estate. So part of the licensing agreement for mudlarks is everyone who goes and purposely looks for historical artifacts along the Thames, you must have a license from the Port of London Authority. And it's about £90 and it lasts for 3 years. So it's a very good deal. And anyone that applies pretty much gets accepted and you get a permit to go down and search for yourself. And as part of that license, anything that you find that's 300 years or older, you have to report to the Museum of London. And that's then recorded on the British Museum's Portable Antiquities Scheme, which is now recorded over 1.5 million artifacts that have been found by the general public here in England and the UK. So it's quite fantastic to actually have things that you find identified by the Museum of London and then recorded on the website that's open to the general public so anybody can learn and see the artifacts that you've found.
And God, just what an amazing resource in terms of a nation building its history, because you basically have people, everyone from, you or historians that are working in museums to little kids that just want to go down there and play. They can all come and, have access to the foreshore or however you guys think about the sides of the river. The harder thing, I would imagine, though, is discovering or doing research about the things you find as a mudlark. So can you talk about, just pick any object that you found that was significant, and then how you went back and researched that to figure out what it is?
Fortunately, with social media these days, it's quite helpful to use these online forums to help you identify things that you don't immediately recognize. And one thing that I found that people online helped me identify was I found this very unusual domed shaped object that had a very tall spike on it. And I'm not sure if you have the book with you. I'll just refer to that page so you know what I'm talking about, and I'll describe it to the listeners. But it's on page 44. And as I was mentioning, it's almost like a dome-shaped piece that has a pyramidal spike on top of that. And it's quite small. And originally when I found it, I thought, oh, maybe it's a spur. So, a lot of people that ride horses, you have a spur on the back of your boot to kind of prod on the horse. But it seemed a bit too flimsy to be a spur. So I posted it on a Facebook group, and somebody was able to identify it for me. And they're a specialist in medieval armory. And they said that this was a medieval knuckle guard from a knight's gauntlet. So, the glove, the protective glove that they would wear, it had a leather kind of glove that was encapsulated, or on the top, it was kind of clad in spiky things to protect your hands and plates of metal. And this is actually made of brass. And you can actually see this got 2 holes, one on both sides, where it was fixed to the leather glove that the knight was wearing below. And so I showed this to the National Armories Museum based in Leeds. I think it's the Royal Armories. And they were able to say that it was worn by a wealthy knight, because normally these types of objects, only the wealthiest knights could afford something made of brass and made of this quality. So that was phenomenally exciting to find something from a medieval knight. And it's been dated back to the 14th, 15th century, which is quite incredible.
Wow. So once you figure that out, you then have this object that is incredibly relevant to the understanding of that era. And as I was reading the book, I was surprised how many times museum people or you guys would reference to museums who said, we weren't quite sure about this. Then someone found an object and it helped us understand the past better. So then do you turn that object over to the museum and they contextualize it, or do you keep that?
So most things are returned back to us. Sometimes they do ask for a donation. So I've donated to many different museums around the UK and also in the United States. But that's the fascinating thing, because everything that is found is adding to the collective knowledge, and it's really building kind of a bigger picture of what was happening at that time period. And a guy from the British Museum, his name is Dr. Michael Lewis. He calls it a jigsaw puzzle. And each piece that we find is adding to the jigsaw puzzle, and they're figuring out the big picture. So all of these small objects that are randomly found are really adding to this bigger picture, and people can actually understand what's going on. And one reference that we did mention in the book is the amount of medieval and post-medieval toys that have been found in the Thames. Originally, historians didn't think that childhood in medieval times was very pleasant. They thought most families had children to not enslave them, but to use those as the workforce, that children were working a lot, not playing a lot like these days. But the vast amount of toys that have been found in the River Thames changed that perspective and really proved that there was a thriving toy industry in the London area back in that time period, so the late medieval period, post-medieval period, and also that the variety of toys is quite amazing, and they kind of replicate what the adults were wearing. So for instance, we find a lot of pocket watches, like toy pocket watches. And that's based on an example from that time period where the father or the mother might have been wearing a pocket watch and the child was kind of imitating them. So it's quite exciting how these different objects reveal something unique about that time period. And the Museum of London has the largest collection of pewter toys in the world, and those have all pretty much been assembled by mudlarks. And the one thing that I didn't mention before is the River Thames is the mud is anaerobic, which means it has no oxygen. So pretty much anything that falls in and gets encapsulated in the mud is perfectly preserved. And that's why we find a lot of leather shoes and other normal degradable objects that on land or in a field, those would have kind of degraded centuries ago. But because it landed in the Thames, it's been perfectly preserved. And these objects come out sometimes as shiny as the day they went into the mud.
One of the things in the book that I thought was interesting is that you had children's toys, but then you also had a lot of games, or at least there was one little section about gambling and sort of devices of gambling that are found in the river. And there was a container, which I'm not sure what the container was, but there were dice inside of that container.
Yeah.
And it turns out after x-raying those when they came out of the river that some of those dice were fixed, like they were loaded dice.
Exactly.
Can you talk about how an object like that tells you about gaming or gambling in a specific time period?
One of the most prolific time periods that we find these gaming pieces from is actually Roman times. And we think that they all are coming out from one specific area on the foreshore. And it was not too far from where some Roman baths were located. So we thought that maybe there was a gaming, not industry, but entertainment area around the baths that were located there. And these objects might have washed out of the drains, or as with the leaded dice, those are probably tossed in the Thames to kind of discard any evidence of foul play. But the dice were interesting because I think there were 25 that were found, and there were a few that had the same numbers repeated on different sides. So anytime you roll it, it's only high numbers. And anytime you roll the other ones, they're only low numbers. And then some had drops of mercury on specific numbers. So it would always fall on that same number. And obviously that was discarded in the Thames to get rid of the evidence. But just going back to the Romans, so we think that that was an actual entertainment area just based on the amount of dice that we find and these circular kind of gaming counters. And I found one that even has Roman letters written on the back of it to indicate the number that it represents.
So what does it feel like to hold an object that's more than 1,000 years old? Like, do you have a personal sensation when you find something like that?
Yeah, it really is spine-tingling experience. Growing up in the States, it's interesting that you and I both grew up in the same town in Virginia. What a coincidence.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't have ever imagined that, like digging a hole in my back garden that, or backyard, that you would find anything of age. I think the oldest thing that I found in Virginia was like Indian arrowheads, like, the flint arrowheads, which again are maybe a couple hundred years old, but not that old. But to find something that's 2,000 years old is just absolutely mind boggling and really does give you goosebumps, and your spine does tingle. So one of my absolute favorite finds, which you might have seen, was this Roman hairpin. And that was a full page image at the beginning of the Roman chapter. So that's shown on page 24. And I actually had my dad over from the States visiting London, and we went mudlarking together. This is before everybody needed a permit to go mudlarking. And he and I were just taking a leisurely stroll along the Thames, and literally I just walked across this object and saw this face staring up at me. So just to explain it to the people listening, it's a hairpin. So you know how like Japanese women, they wear their hair up in a bun, they stick a long pin through it to hold it into place. Roman women used to use those same hairpins 2,000 years ago. And this is actually carved of animal bone. And you can see at the top of the pin is the carved face of a woman. And she has very high false curls, as they call it. And so the Museum of London was able to date that based on the style of the hair. And they said that dates back to the Flavian period. So they dated it between 43 AD and 100 AD. So that's nearly 2,000 years old. And an elegant woman would have purchased that and would have worn that. So I just have this vision in my head that she was walking for a beautiful evening stroll along the Thames. A gust of wind blew the hairpin out of her hair and into the Thames. And then 2,000 years later, as I was walking with my dad along the foreshore, we just stumbled upon it. And the beauty about the Thames is the foreshore is constantly being churned around. And because there's a lot of boats in central London that kick up quite substantial waves, that's kind of slowly combing the riverbed or eroding the riverbed and shifting things around. So that's why you can just walk along the Thames. You don't need a metal detector. You don't need a trowel. You can just find stuff just laying on the riverbed that's just been exposed by either the receding tide or by these waves that have crashed onto the surface and churned up the surface of the foreshore.
When you think about a hairpin like that, that would have been something that cost, I would imagine, a good bit of money. Like there's a lot of effort to make that, especially carved out of bone. I liked in the book that you kind of break things up by era. The beginning eras, things are made from metal, things that are long lasting, also valuable. Then as you get more towards our time, you talk about how like a lot of what we dispose in, or what is disposed in the Thames now is plastics, things that we don't think of as valuable. So as someone who's trying to find these things or is consciously going out and looking, do you have to literally just like sift through bottle caps to be able to find, a hairpin like that? Or how does it work to get through the literal trash to get to the treasure?
Yeah, fortunately, the Thames has gotten cleaner and cleaner, and it was considered biologically dead back in the 1950s. But as the industry has kind of moved away from London, also all of the debris and whatnot has been moved on as well. And the water itself is becoming much clearer. So to be honest, there isn't a lot to sift through down there. You have a lot of older stuff like broken glass, a lot of metalwork, like rusting metalwork. So there's a lot of nasty things down there, but you don't see that much plastic. I mean, in different areas where it collects a bit more than others, but you don't see that much plastic, fortunately, when you're down there. So you're not sifting through a lot of modern stuff to find the old stuff. It's a lot of pebbles and rocks and mud that you're sifting through, not necessarily modern rubbish or trash.
If you're going to go mudlarking, you have to go at low tide, or I would imagine at least like when low tide is coming and going. So how long do you have before the tide starts coming back?
So it all depends on the lunar cycles. So the tide is at a different time every day. And anyone that lives along the coast, whether in America or elsewhere, you always have to watch the tide tables to find out when the low tides and the high tides are going to be. So that kind of sets out my my planner for the month is just based on the tide tables. So I actually have it right next to me in my drawer here. But this is like my little Bible that I look at just to kind of find out when exactly the next low tide is going to be. And as you can see, I've even highlighted when the key low tides are coming up. So I believe in March this year, you can see I've highlighted quite a few dates and low tides coming up. So literally, I kind of plan out my year based on when the low tides are going to happen. So typically, depending on where you're going, typically I go about 3 hours before low tide and I stay about 1 hour after low tide. And that's because the tide goes out much slower than it comes back in. So it almost comes racing back in, and you can really notice it coming in very quickly, whereas it takes much longer to go out. And it's pretty much on a 6 hour cycle. So you have high tide at one time, then 6 hours later, low tide, then 6 hours later, high tide, et cetera, et cetera. So over a 24-hour period, you've got 2 high tides and 2 low tides. So that's kind of the rhythm that we follow. But for myself, typically it's the very early morning and the very late night tides, which are the best. And normally that's every 2 weeks. And then in the spring low tides during the day are very low. And then in the summer, it's the extreme low tides are at night. And we also go night larking. So we put on our headlamps and we go out in the middle of the night when the tide's the lowest and just go searching for these artifacts. But it's kind of a wonderful experience. You never go alone. You're always with friends, but there's quite a few party boats that are on the river. So you can hear the kind of Beyonce and Bee Gees and all your favorite dance tunes as you're mudlarking in the dark with friends. And yeah, you take a couple of beers with you and you make an evening of it. So it's good fun.
Well, I'm glad you brought up that this is a communal activity because it seems like there are some names that keep popping up throughout the book. I think Nick Stevens, did you guys wrote the book together, correct?
Yes, yeah, we did, yes.
So can you talk about people like him and other community members that have formed sort of the gang of Mudlarks? Or I think you guys even have a society, right?
Yes, yeah. So it's a very nice community. We all like archaeology and the history of London, and just going down and getting exercise, fresh air. Always the sound of crashing waves is a plus. So it's nice, even though we live in a very bustling metropolis, that we can go down and find nature in the center of the city and just get away from all the hustle and bustle. So mudlarks typically are very friendly. Everybody has, as I said, this passionate interest in history and finding something. And you're always trying to compare your finds to the next guy's finds and trying to figure out who found the best thing. So it's not only on the foreshore, but on social media, we have several different groups on Facebook and Instagram and other platforms as well. But we do have a Society of Thames Mudlarks, which is an official society, and we have special rights that the other mudlarks don't have. As you can imagine, there's quite a lot of historically significant artifacts that are down there. And so to protect the history, only certain people can dig in certain areas or use metal detectors in certain areas. And I had to wait for about 6 years to get into the society. You have a waiting list and you get your name on the waiting list and wait for quite a long period of time. But in that time, you record as much as you can with the Museum of London. You kind of build trust that you are a reputable person and that they can trust you with these special privileges that you have as the society members. So it's capped at about 50 people, and that's just because of the room size where we meet on a kind of a quarterly basis. It's a pub in Southwark, not too far from the river, where we meet. But it's a really good group, and we have lectures almost every time. Different people coming and presenting kind of different lectures about archaeology, about London history. Sometimes we have older mudlarks showing us their best finds, etc. So it's really good to learn something and also just kind of share with each other. And the Museum of London is also there to record our finds.
The Museum of London has a fantastic ceramic collection, and I'm just putting it together in my head that I wonder if some of this is the information that mudlarks are given, because there's a lot of fragments in their collection, and I bet you that they have come out of the Thames. I've just never thought about that.
They don't like to quote a specific number, but I read about 5 years ago that they've assembled about 90,000 different artifacts from the Thames that were gifted to them from mudlarks. So that's quite a substantial collection of artifacts that have been found in the river that are in the museum's collections. But pottery, I think pottery, because it is such a durable material, you can find that both on land and in the river. The river provides very interesting finds, like I was saying, about leather goods and other biodegradable things, because they actually survive in the river, whereas on land, unless it's a waterlogged condition, those materials don't survive. So I think that's why they have such a vast amount of pottery and ceramics and porcelain, is just because that's prevalent both on land and in the river.
Yeah, actually, there's a fantastic picture you have in the book of the top of a Bartman or a Beardman jug. So when you think about ceramics, because this, I'm a potter and this is a podcast, we talk a lot about ceramics. What are the styles of ceramics that you have found personally and that tend to come up in the river?
Yeah, so it's quite interesting, the wide range. And I always say that the river is almost like a washing machine and is constantly kind of churning things around. So you can find a modern piece of broken willow pattern right next to an ancient Roman piece of Samian ware. And we find a wide variety. And it was quite fun as a beginning mudlark to try to figure out this style. What is that? Is that kind of tin glazed Delftware from the 17th century, or is that modern willow pattern? So you kind of learn as you go. And also the colors changed over the years as well. So like Romans, they had kind of a darker color palette, except for like the Samian ware, which is kind of almost a bright orange color or reddish orange color. And then you move into the medieval period, which is all about the green glaze and the kind of the light tan colors that they liked, like from Kingston, along the river. Kingston pottery was very famous for their different types of pottery that they created there, medieval pottery. And then the Tudors, they loved their kind of glaze, green glaze as well. And then you move into like the German stoneware, where you have the Westerwald stoneware, which is one of my personal favorites because it has these beautiful blue and manganese tones to them and beautiful kind of ornate designs with lions and faces. And then, like you were saying, the Bartman, the Bellarmine jugs, as we call them, with the bearded faces on them, and the cartouche or the medallions on their bellies. And then on into the Stuart period with the tin glaze. And another one that we find a lot of is, I'm not sure if you know, the Staffordshire comb slipware, which is a very yellow glaze that has brown kind of combed slipware through that. And it's such a striking pattern, especially against the dark background of the foreshore. Those yellow pieces just really jump out at you, and they're just so they look like a cake almost. Even have like a pie crust edge if you get the edge of a piece, which is quite nice. So it's fascinating. I mean, there's just so much pottery down there in all different shapes and sizes. And as we showed in the book, some of these come out complete. And people have been finding Roman pots that are complete, that are over 1,700 years old. And it's just fascinating to find bits of pottery. I find it better if it's not complete, because then you have to do a bit of research and find out exactly what it was attached to.
And really, you're talking about the history of European ceramics, but also the history of European trade. So you mentioned, I guess it was the 1600s when British society was really captivated with the Westerwald German wares. So what that shows is that there's trade happening, and it also with obviously with the Roman Empire, like that was in the British Empire for that that matter, all these empires, they're built on trade from very far distances. So what are the things that you guys find that are surprising because they're from somewhere that's either so far away or that maybe people didn't know that there was a lot of trade happening?
Do you know what a costrel is?
I don't know.
It's almost like a flask, and it has two handles, and it was used to transport wine or even water, etc. And Mudlark found almost a complete one that was, it's been researched, and they found out it's originally from Italy, but it's a beautiful piece of ceramic, almost complete, and it has two lion's heads on both sides that were the handles. And I think that's one of the most interesting ones that kind of shows the old trade routes coming from mainland Europe, etc. But as we were just mentioning, there's so much German stoneware that was just extremely popular in Tudor and Tudor times and in the 17th century. And obviously that was exported throughout the world. So even in Jamestown, Virginia, they found quite a few Bellarmine jugs in that part during their excavations of Jamestown.
So there's been a couple events in London's history that were catastrophic. One was the bubonic plague. I guess there's been a couple plagues that have gone through London, but the Black Death was a big one. I think it was estimated that half of London's population died, in that era. Then there's also the Great Fire of London. I think that was 1660s something.
1666, yeah.
Gotcha. So when you have these catastrophic events, what does the river record from those events? Like what can you find from those?
That's a very interesting question. So you can really read what was happening along the river's edge by what's been dumped onto the riverbed. And there's very interesting areas which are filled with evidence of what happened from different time periods. So specifically, the Great Fire of London in 1666, because most of the city of London, the heart of the city, was destroyed. The rubble and the debris was just swept into the river because, again, the Thames has always been the garbage bin or the garbage can of London for 2,000 years. So there's a whole area near St. Paul's Cathedral and Millennium Bridge, which literally the riverbed is red from all of the roof tiles. And what's interesting is you can actually see the holes in the tiles where the pegs were actually located. And you can actually imagine that those were originally affixed to the roof. And I think I've actually included a photo of my own of that. If you turn to page 6 in the book, the illustration at the bottom of that page, it literally shows you thousands of roof tiles, red roof tiles that are still laying on the riverbed that are nearly 350 years old, and that's when they were swept in. And those are probably either medieval or Tudor roof tiles that after the Great Fire, they just literally just shoved all the debris into the river. The other big catastrophe in London was the London Blitz back in the 1940s. So as you know, German bombers, the Luftwaffe, bombed London, carpet bombed London very, very heavily, especially during 1941. And again, a lot of these buildings that they were targeting were along the river because London was the largest port in Britain at that time, if not this part of the world. And therefore, that was a huge target of the German Luftwaffe. And unfortunately, the River Thames, it's beautiful. It has a very distinct horseshoe shape around the Canary Wharf and Greenwich area. And the German bombers would fly up the river, and they knew exactly at the horseshoe, that's where all of these docks, it's called the Docklands, that's where they were located. So the German bombers had a very easy target. They knew exactly at the horseshoe, drop all of your bombs, and they devastated that whole area. And a lot of the buildings along the river that were blown up, literally the whole facade just fell into the river. And then over the last 100 years, well, not 100 years, 80 years or whatever it is now since World War II, those bricks have been tumbled. So you find a lot of tumbled bricks from the London Blitz, from the buildings that were blown up at that time period. Then other parts of the river were associated with shipbuilding and shipbreaking. And you can still find a lot of the tools that they use for breaking up ships. You can also see all of the ironwork that's just been left and dumped on the riverbed. And in some locations, literally as you walk across, you're not stepping on rocks or rubble or sand. It's literally just rusting ironwork, which really gives you an indication of what was happening all those years ago. And they even think that the Mayflower, the famous Mayflower ship that originated from London, it returned back to London in 1621 after it dropped off the Pilgrims. And they think it was also broken up on the River Thames. And then famously, a barn was made out of it in Kent. They reused the timbers to make a barn, and it's now called the Mayflower Barn.
So as I'm flipping through this book, you have stories of devastation. So like if a building is blown up and, part of the building falls in, like no one plans that. But then there's also stories you tell that are kind of touching, kind of heartbreaking about people that are in love, and they might be given, I think they were called love coins or love badges or even rings, where these rings show up in the river. And the idea is that someone broke up, they were upset, they take their ring off, they throw it into the river.
Yeah.
Can you talk about how you can, on one hand, see war in the river, and on the other hand, see symbols of love in the river?
Yeah, it actually, it happens throughout the centuries. So not just then, but also now that's still happening. So just to start with then, so one of the oldest love tokens that I've found is from Tudor times, and it's a silver sixpence, and it actually has Queen Elizabeth I, so the famous first Elizabeth I. Her bust is on the front of the coin. And what they did to fashion a love token is they would bend it in two directions, so it would make an S shape, which was kind of considered an eternal love shape. So they would form the S-shaped token, and then you would give that to the person that you had feelings for or affections for. And if they return that, they would keep it. And sometimes we find them pierced with a hole where they probably wore it around their necks just as a symbol of their affection for the person or the boyfriend or girlfriend that they were in love with. But we often find them tossed into the Thames. And I think I have about 5 of these bent love tokens now. And they're made of precious metals, so mostly silver. And the most popular were from William III. So the end of the 17th century. A lot of his sixpence were actually used to form these love tokens. And one of my friends, and it's also in the book, he found a Georgian gold guinea that was formed into a love token. And obviously that was a very expensive coin back then. So it must have been a rich person that received that, because you wouldn't throw a gold coin into the Thames unless you had money yourself already. So this idea of love is, it's throughout the ages. And what you're mentioning about the rings, they're called posy rings. And that originates from the word poem. And they would write a small poem around the circumference inside the band of the ring. And again, you would write that and give it to the person that you loved or had affections for. If they kept it, then that means that you were courting. If not, then obviously they didn't like you. But these rings are absolutely stunning, and they have different messages on them, and some are highly decorated. And we have one in the book that's even two hands that are clasping a heart, and it's got a beautiful inscription inside the ring. And that one's made of gold.
And when I think about this, it really talks about how love has not changed, but the way human beings have given each other objects that symbolize love is so different. So like in those courting rituals, you started with an object. And if they accepted the object, then you were courting. For us, you might date someone for years before you would ever get engaged and then give a ring or some sort of token. So it's just really interesting how the river in some ways can talk about very esoteric things like the transition of love over time, but it also can talk about very specific things like pandemic. Like you mentioned that now you're seeing sort of PPE and masks that are starting to show up in the river. So can you talk about what you think our culture now, like what are we leaving that people in the future are going to find?
Yeah, it is a lot of trash, to be honest. We find a lot of mobile phones, cell phones, iPhones in the Thames. Obviously, because of COVID now, we do find a lot of face masks and the PPE. But one of the most beautiful things is we do find plastic bottles, but some of them actually contain notes. And I find those to be the nicest. And I'm not sure if you read that story about Nicola White finding a little boy's note inside of a bottle. And he wished that he could be a Power Ranger, the Red Power Ranger. And she was able to post that note on her Twitter feed. And within 3 hours, they were able to identify the child, even though all he put was his first name on there and no address or anything. So she was able to track down the child. She bought him a Red Power Ranger suit and sent it to him. And then she got a beautiful letter in return saying thank you. And it had 2 beautiful pictures of him wearing the suit. And I posted that on Instagram. And the actual Red Power Ranger, the Hollywood film star, contacted me and said he would actually contact the kid directly. So it's just these small things. You make a wish, you throw it into the Thames, and a few weeks later, you actually have what you requested. So again, It just shows the big hearts of the Mudlarks as well, willing to fulfill those dreams that they find.
Yeah, and it's just one of those stories about like the message in the bottle. In my mind, that's not like no one actually does that. But what you guys are finding is actually a lot of people do that over a long amount of time, because you guys have found messages in bottles from, much older than our current era.
Yeah, even from like soldiers coming back from war or going abroad from war, they would chuck in a message in a bottle. So Nicola, where she's searching is more towards the estuary, and that's where they kind of collect. I've only found a handful of them in central London, but she's found over 100 bottles with messages inside, and each one has a very fascinating message. Some are desperate people that are just really in a bad state. Others are dreaming. Others are wanting something. Others are just kind of writing from the heart. But each one is kind of a heartfelt message. If you go through that much trouble, you really do have something that you want to communicate. And I think people that do put those in the river do want them found. You don't put it in there just for your own good. You do expect somebody to find those. So.
You mentioned that Nicola has 100 of those. Is it that she focuses on that? And like, for instance, do you have a focus of things you're trying to find? Or is it more that if you search in a certain place, you're bound to find a lot of one thing?
It kind of depends on where you're going. So there's different areas. So where Nicola's searching is there's a lot more kind of debris washing up in those areas. And like the plastic does collect in those areas. Whereas I'm searching in more areas which are quite clean and don't have much debris on them. But I think as you as you experience more, as you go on different adventures along the Thames, you kind of gravitate towards different things that you like. Like, for instance, I like Roman artifacts. So there's one area of London that I go to find Roman things. Other people like Georgian things. So you go to those areas where the Georgians were very prevalent. So you kind of learn to know where to go to find different things. So I live in West London, And there's just mainly kind of Victorian and early 20th century stuff in my area. But so you kind of learn as you go, and as you discover different things, you kind of know where things do turn up, and different people are looking for different things. And you can kind of look at your collection and say, oh yeah, I guess I do collect a lot of coins. Or one of my friends is like, oh yeah, I do collect a lot of knives. So it's just yeah, you start to assemble things that you really do like.
One of the most striking images in the book, well, there's many, and it's really well photographed. So I wanted to commend you for collecting all these photos from, different people, and probably from yourself as well. But one of the most striking photos is a full human skull. So can you talk about the story of who that belonged to, at least in that photo?
Yeah, so this was the co-author of the book, Nick Stevens, and he was on an evening stroll with his dog along the River Thames, and he was searching, doing a bit of mudlarking as he was walking the dog, and I think his wife was preparing dinner, and he found this skull and called her and said, sorry, I'm not going to be home for dinner tonight. I'm going to be a bit tied up. So he found that skull, which literally, if you see the image, it's a full human skull with the jaw, teeth still intact, staring straight up at him. And he took that photograph with his cell phone. So it wasn't like a professional photograph or anything. It literally was shot from the hip. He called the police straight away. And we do find a lot of bones on the River Thames foreshore. And mainly they're animal bones because, again, the river was just the trash can for all of London. So whenever you finished your meal, you would just throw in the bones, or the slaughterhouses, they would just chuck in the animal remains into the river. So there's a lot of bones. In some areas, it looks like a graveyard down there. So when Nick called the police, they were like, are you sure it's human? Because we've gotten a lot of calls from different people saying they found bones on the foreshore. And he's like, I'm very sure it's a human skull. So the police came down, but they were a bit late and the tide had already come in. So Nick put a stake down right next to the skull. So he knew exactly where it was, even though it was submerged by water. And the police kind of were looking at each other like, who's going to go retrieve it? And Nick was the only one with rubber boots on. So he walked out and retrieved it. And he said it was like holding a bowling ball. He literally put his fingers, two fingers in the eye sockets and one in the nose, and just pulled it out with a pop sound. And the police bagged it and took it away. And he didn't hear back from the police for a while. And so he rang up the local police station where they had taken it to, and they didn't find out too much, but they said that they closed the case because they knew it was older. It wasn't a modern or a recent death. It was something that happened in the past. So he was able to, you obviously can't keep human bones. So he was able to call up the Thames Discovery Program, which is an archaeological unit which was able to assist him. So they were able to radiocarbon date it, and they were able to find out that it's from the 18th century, and that it's the skull of a 12-year-old girl. And with the Thames Discovery Program, they were able to recover the rest of her skeleton. So they found the entire skeleton of this poor girl that died at age 12. And based on the analysis of the teeth, they were able to see that she had rickets and that she was malnourished, and that she even had growth arrest when she was a small girl. So it was quite exciting that they were able to analyze it in so much detail and find out about this Londoner who unfortunately perished back in the 18th century. But as you can imagine, that was quite a shock to find a skull and then a full skeleton down on the bed of the River Thames.
It talks too about burial practice, like because it was thought that she was buried with her feet towards the water and the head towards the land, right?
Yes.
Which is interesting because it gives you the sense that there was something ritualistic about burying a child close to the river.
Yeah, we're not sure if she actually washed out from a gravesite, which could have been closer, because obviously the river is constantly changing. And as the water shifts around, and also as they embank the river or put up river walls. So we're just not sure exactly if she was purposely put in the river, or whether that the course of the river changed over time, and she just ended up in the river herself. But yeah, it did seem ritualistic just because of, as you were mentioning, the position that she was buried in. It wasn't a sloppy kind of, you didn't just find a loose skeleton. She was all there laying in a straight line.
Well, to wrap up, I wanted to talk about social media, because that's how I found you, is through social media, and actually found out about the book through social media as well. And we should specifically plug, the book is coming out in April.
In the US, yeah, it's out in Britain and I think other European countries next month, so on the 18th of February. But I think it's out in America on the 21st of April.
So with social media now, it's the images of what you found. That's what attracted me to you as a mudlark, because I found your Instagram and I was scrolling through, and as a potter, I'm just like, whoa, look at all this ceramic history. So can you talk about how social media has helped connect you not only with your fellow mudlarks, but to tell the rest of the world about the stories that you're discovering through mudlarking?
Social media is a fantastic tool. Obviously, it can be used for negative purposes, as we saw recently with the Capitol building. But my experience has been very good with Instagram. And Instagram is very image based. So you post a photo rather than a lot of text, unlike Twitter. Twitter is all about the text, and Instagram is much more about the photos. But I think what attracts so many people to following mudlarks is just seeing what they actually find on almost a daily basis. And I think that just brings archaeology alive for people, because a lot of times when you go to a museum, everything's kind of encased in glass. You can't really touch the objects. You have no tangible connection with the history. You can read about it, you can look at it, but there's no kind of connection with it. And I think that's the beauty of mudlarking, is just it really is archaeology for everyone. And even my young children find things down there. Now that I've told them what to look for, they have found some stunning artifacts down on the River Thames. And it just brings history alive. I hated reading about history and history books when I was a kid growing up in Virginia. But just finding something, and then you just spend hours on social media and on the internet just researching these finds and trying to discover the interesting backstories behind these objects. And I think it's both a visual, but also it takes you on an immediate journey, and it connects you with history in a very tangible way.
What is your Instagram so people could follow?
So it's one word, Jason Mudlark. So Jason and then Mudlark.
And then where can people get the book?
So in the United States, it's available. I even saw it at Target bookstore, so on Target online, Barnes and Nobles, Book Depository, Amazon, of course, and most online bookstores all have it. And it's called Thames Mudlarking: Searching for London's Lost Treasures.
One last question. We discovered before this interview that we're actually both from this exact same town in Virginia, which is really just amazing. Have you ever found anything from Virginia?
That's a very good question. It's very difficult to say it's exactly from Virginia, but as I was saying, a lot of these clay pipes were filled with tobacco, and some of them were even pre-filled with tobacco. And because the mud kind of packs in to the bowl of the pipe, some of the tobacco is often still locked at the bottom of the pipe. So technically, some of that tobacco could have been from Virginia, but I haven't found anything specifically with Virginia written on it, or anything that I can definitively say that was from the early colonies. But my ancestors sailed over from Britain and immigrated to America back in 1638. And when I find things from that time period, like coins that are dated that exact date or other things, it's just like, wow, my ancestors could have been holding these exact coins or this exact clay pipe, or even some of the children's toys that we find. it's just like, wow, this is from that time period. My ancestors might have had that in their pockets.
Well, I wanted to thank you for coming on the podcast, and really appreciate you taking the time to do the interview.
No problem. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
I'd like to thank Jason for coming on the podcast. It was a pleasure to talk with him, and it was such an amazing thing to find out that we lived in the same small town in Virginia for many years at the same time. If you'd like to follow Jason, you can do that on Instagram under Jason Mudlark. The book Thames Mudlarking is out now in Europe and will be out soon in the US in early April. Before I go, I wanted to give one more plug for today's Amico Community Corkboard, which is in support of Pot LA. This is a studio space that is owned and operated by artists of color with a mission to create a space that feels accessible and empowering to those that felt marginalized in other ceramic spaces. To help support Pot, you can donate to them at their GoFundMe campaign. You can find that under gofundme.com/help-pot. I'll be back next week with another episode. Thanks as always for tuning in. If you'd like more information on the artists on the show, or if you'd like more information about the workshops and events that I'll be having in the next couple months, you can follow me on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook under Carter Pottery. Another great way to support the show is to leave me a comment on iTunes. To do that, search Tales of a Red Clay Rambler under iTunes Podcasts, and you'll find a page that's linked to our show. Thank you guys for the support.